Got it, everyone. As you're coming in, we'll give it 1 minute to allow people to the access process to work through, and then we'll get started. Welcome. Welcome. If you're just joining us, I'm just going to wait for the attendee numbers to stabilize. They're still climbing as people are getting let in. So as soon as that number stabilizes, I'll get going. And that is right about now. Okay, welcome everyone to the third webinar that is discussing the TTM Credentials Framework. I'm Dave Tilton. You would have seen me in the previous webinars. I'm the chairperson of New Zealand's Temporary Traffic Management Industry Steering Group. And I'm hosting the webinar today, but hosting it on behalf of the TTM Credentials Framework Working Group. So that's the bulk of the people that will be speaking to you today. I'm just going to act as a moderator and a facilitator of the conversation. Next slide, please, Helen. And that's just covering what our purpose is. So today we're simply trying to do as much question and answering as possible. We've received some questions in writing prior to the webinar, and we're going to address as many of those as we possibly can, as well as save some time at the end of the webinar for some open questions from the floor. So the next slide, you'll see our agenda, which covers what I've just mentioned. We've identified 9 themes from the questions we've received so far, and we're going to try and cover those 9 themes first with you. That'll take roughly about 40 minutes. And then the last 20 minutes will be questions that we receive on the fly during the webinar itself. And of course, we've got the whole panel of panelists in behind the scenes that'll be answering written questions throughout the whole webinar. So feel free to use the Q&A and dive in and submit your questions. And we've got 14 panelists in behind who you'll hear from independently throughout this webinar too. They'll all be independently or individually answering a bunch of questions as we go. So the first question that has come up, I'm going to talk to, and that relates to one piece of feedback we've had is around people quite not understanding what this framework actually is. So why do we have or why do we need a new one? So on the screen is the current training and competency model from NZTA. This is what's in place right now. This model is being retired. So NZTA are no longer going to be providing or mandating a centralized training and warrant system for TTM. And that means we need a model to replace it. The replacement isn't coming from a central agency, though. It's coming from the industry itself. So the Credentials Framework Working Group, who are presenting today, are part of the Industry Steering Group, and they've developed this new model to replace this one on the screen when it's gone. So the new framework is developed by industry for industry. So you can see it's more simple. It doesn't talk about roles, but it does talk about capabilities and skills. And it also focuses on the amount and the type of risk that people need to manage. So not road levels and not categories. So what is a framework? What does it we mean by a framework? Well, each person working in TTM needs a collection of skills to do their job. Those skills build upon each other. So early skills are things like what PPE to wear or how to install a sign. And as someone progresses and takes on more responsibility, they learn higher skills like how to park safely when doing work near the road or giving a safety briefing. These skills can be grouped into credentials. So a credential is a form of qualification, like a New Zealand certificate or a micro-credential. And these are recognized qualifications from NZQA. So every blue box that you see in the TTM Credentials Framework is a credential, where people can earn a recognized qualification by achieving the requirements. So a framework is a collection of credentials arranged to allow people to follow a career pathway of stacking credentials that are relevant to them. In isolation, each credential is a set of skills. But together, credentials that follow a pathway allow someone to progress through a career, gaining more capability as they grow. It also means someone can stack together just the right credentials for their role. So organizations can choose the right credentials for their people. And also remembering that credentials, the credentials framework won't give everyone everything they need. So employers will still have to fill plenty of gaps. The TTM Credentials Framework will not cover everything, and it can only cover the things that are common across all organizations. So the last slide that I'll talk to is, before we get into some more specific questions, is in relation to this model being not compulsory. So the current training and competency model that we work to is adopted as a compulsory model. So NZTA requires it, as well as all RCAs in New Zealand. To work on the road, you need a warrant that relates to the task that you're doing. The TTM Credentials Framework is not compulsory. It's developed by the TTM industry, and there's no organization requiring people to adopt it. However, the Health and Safety at Work Act requires PCBUs or organizations to provide training, instruction, and supervision to people. This isn't about a license to do a job. It's about people having enough competency to keep themselves and other people safe. So this credentials framework is about that. It's about providing a framework for employers to fulfill their Health and Safety at Work Act duties, rather than just get a license to work on the road. And whilst it isn't compulsory, the Health and Safety at Work Act is. And so if employers don't adopt this framework, that's fine. But they must have a way that ensures all their people have got the required training, instruction, or supervision to carry out their work safely. By working together to develop this framework, the TTM industry can reduce the amount of effort that all employers would have to give to develop their own system from top to bottom and allow better consistency across the industry. So that's the motivation behind this new framework. So that's my introductory framing content for you that relates to some of the questions we've received. I'm going to move on now to individual questions that some of the team are going to respond to. So this first one was submitted, and I'm going to ask Michelle from Waihanga to dive in and answer this, because Waihanga are the responsible party as a standard setting body. So Michelle, if you could help us with this one, that'd be great.
Kia ora. So what is a TAG group is the first question, and that is a group of technical advisors. So Waihanga Araro is the Construction Infrastructure Workforce Development Council, and we are responsible for working with industry and translating the skills and knowledge into the credentials that will be on the NZQA framework. So that includes the temporary traffic management credentials. So the first step is to form a technical advisory group with a range of industry representatives, and they can help articulate the skills that are required for each of the credentials. They also make sure that the technical advice is in line with the TTM competency framework legislation and related to the best practice guides like the New Zealand Guide to Temporary Traffic Management and the WorkSafe guidelines for keeping health and safe while working on the road or roadside. The technical advisors work with us, making sure the skills are described are relevant and to the work sites on the road, and particularly in the New Zealand context. They make sure that the learning outcomes and assessment criteria describe the standards, and that there are no barriers to good practice. So how does that result in the skill standards and then the credentials? So once the TAG or the Technical Advisory Group has drafted the standards or the micro-credentials, the next step is that wider industry will have a chance to provide consultation, and there's feedback groups around that, include the TTM Credentials Framework Group and a wider consultation group. The standards also go through an internal peer review inside Waihanga Araro that makes sure that we meet the requirements for NZQA so that they can be registered So any feedback that we get from the evaluators at NZQA will go back to industry to be considered, especially if they're related to the technical skills. Once a final evaluation is completed by NZQA, the skill standards and micro-credentials and qualifications will be registered and available. So, which leads on to the second question: what happens after the credentials are on the NZQCF, which is the New Zealand Qualifications Credentials Framework? Is that they are published, and which means our providers are able to use them in their programs. So providers who want to use the TTM skill standards in their programs are required to have what we call consent to assess. So it's a permission from NZQA, and part of that process is to have the Waihinga Araro letter of support. Likewise, any micro-credentials that are a provider wants to approve will come through us as well for support, so that we can loop it back to industry. We heard from industry what was needed, and we can ensure that programs meet those requirements. So if a provider already has consent to assess, like some do now, they will develop a program and they will submit that to NZQA. The providers will be able to talk a little bit about what happens for them to make the programs available for industry to enrol in a little bit later on. Kia ora.
Thank you, Michelle. That's awesome. And if you're all wondering what a provider is, we're talking about a provider in the context of the NZQA system. So we will talk to that a little bit more later in this webinar, but it's important you differentiate between a NZQA provider and a TTM provider. They're not the same thing. We'll talk to that soon, but let's move on, and we will we'll call on Paul Tyson, a member of the Credentials Framework Group, who's going to talk to this one just around roles, skills, competencies, and so on. Take it away, Paul.
Thanks, Dave. So I thought it was quite important that we talk about what is a skill or a competency first. And effectively, a competency is just knowledge, abilities, behaviors, those learned attributes of an individual or an organization. Generally, when we talk about our people, it's our individuals. It's the competencies they need to perform tasks. In our world, it might be things like operate a pilot vehicle or set up and manage alternating flow, those sorts of things. Those are all competencies. If we go back and look at the framework doesn't look to specifically outline every competency. I think if we did that, we would be here forever. The framework would be massive, highly detailed, and it starts to become a tad too prescriptive and doesn't allow flexibility enough for PCBUs, contractors, to put in place a measure of innovation and deal with things from a risk-based way. So the framework is there to manage or to guide some of those core knowledge or skills that individuals may need. What we've got to reflect on as employers and as contractors is the vast range of competencies that our people might need, and that a framework has enough adaptability to allow those competencies to operate and flow between. We're hoping to get a little bit of time at the end. We might give you a little bit of an example of how some of those competencies may align within the framework. And then coming back into roles. Now, a role, we do it every day in almost everything we do, including TTM. We look at individual people's competencies and then identify whether they have the capabilities to undertake certain roles. Within our organizations, we'll have people who are great at setting up and managing traffic management controls for resale operations, or undertaking mobile activities for A-type or B-type line marking. So they've got those core competencies, and we're satisfied that they can take on a measure of leadership or a role to deliver that work. So there's very specific differences there. So the framework doesn't look to identify STMS. STMS is actually a role. It's the role of a site traffic management supervisor who has the appropriate skills and competencies, made up of knowledge and things like that, to be able to go undertake the tasks that we have confidence in them undertaking. So obviously not a function of the framework to do that for us. If we try and relate that to qualification, which ultimately is the output of the framework, qualification is just something that actually identifies somebody has been able to demonstrate sufficient knowledge or core knowledge and core skills. And like I say, that's what the framework looks to identify, just the core stuff that we think, or the industry feels, is why we're consulting, obviously, that we need as a baseline for the industry. Everything else over and above that, all the additional skills and competencies that we should generally, and we generally do on a day-to-day basis, manage, we still need to manage. We still need to have systems and processes around how our people develop from entry-level sort of general labourers to doing more traffic control type duties, to undertaking more leadership relative to their skills and competencies and experience. That's the PCBU part, to identify those roles based on individuals. Yeah, so hopefully that covered that one off a little bit more. Will there still be a nominated STMS for a site? Yes. So as a conclusion, that's the PCBU's function, to identify the people with appropriate skills and competencies to be able to delegate that role to a person. The role isn't associated to a qualification anymore. A person just needs to demonstrate they've got appropriate competencies, may be supported with a measure of qualification if that becomes a specification or some agreement within the contracting chain, but otherwise it's based on their abilities to do things. It doesn't limit anybody from wearing the STMS jacket.
Thanks, Paul. Awesome. And I'm going to take the next step, and this next slide's for me to talk to, which is in relation to something we've known for a while, that is associating qualifications with different risk factors. So a while ago, we used to use road levels as how you determine whether you can work in a particular environment. You had a level 1 STMS, level 2, 3 STMS. Then we moved on to categories, which is what we have now: category A, category B, category C, which is based on speed and the number of lanes of how much risk there is. But those are just individual risk factors. When in developing this model, the Credentials Framework Working Group chose to adopt layered risk as the mechanism for determining where you are in the framework. So at level 1, the lower level of the framework focuses on instructions, following instructions, or level 2, which is around basic situational awareness. So those are the real entry-level risk management requirements for someone working in TTM. As you go further up the levels of risk management, you get to level 3, which is your ability to do regular risk assessment and mitigation, where you can take an existing risk assessment and apply it to a particular situation and make sure it works. A level above that would be around the level 4 level. We're talking about dynamic risk assessment. So maybe that's related to utilizing generic TMPs, where the risk assessment isn't complete yet, and you need to finish it off by doing that physically, that component of it on site. Or maybe it's emergency works, where you're actually having to make a lot of the risk decisions at the last minute. And level 5 being influencing safety culture. So now you're influencing other people's response and management of risk. So by adopting this layered risk model, rather than using a particular risk factor like speed or the number of lanes or the road volume, we get a broader view of how much risk management someone in TTM is capable of doing. And the more capable they are, the higher they're going to operate in the framework. So this is the basis for the model. It's important for people to have that background so they know why there is a difference in the types of skills that show up at higher levels versus lower levels. So that's my last piece. And the next question comes back to Connexus. So I'm going to ask Melissa to dive in and answer this next one, which relates to assessments and what they might look like. So Melissa, if you can grace us with some knowledge, that'd be awesome.
Sure thing. So as Michelle mentioned before, individual skill standards will be developed by Waihanga Araro with industry, and those skill standards will make up a credential. Waihanga Araro, in collaboration with industry, they also develop guidance information for these credentials, And that guidance information gives providers the guidance on the intention from industry of how a credential will be assessed and delivered. For Connexus as a provider, we would also consult with industry around preferred methods of delivery, as well as following that guidance from Waihanga Araro. And this would be looked at for each of the individual credentials as they come through. Connexus assessments will always be assessed by a Connexus registered assessor. There are workplace assessors, and they are the people who are employed by the company that works with the learner. And when necessary, we may also use contracted assessors to support workplaces who don't have the capacity or the capability to do that in-house. So each assessment would be looked at individually by the credentials as they come through. There's a wide range of different methods that you could look at, from theory, practical, on-job, off-job, and that would be considered as each credential comes through.
Awesome. And you can stay with us, because I'm going to bring Kim in here as well from NZTA, who is going to help answer the next question, which just relates to what we currently do in terms of training and assessment and trainers and assessors, and then maybe contrasting that with how that might be different in the future, which is a key question we've got. So Kim, if you can, I think you're going to start with this one.
Sure am. So in the future, Waka Kotahi won't be training or certifying assessors like we currently do. And so that's because the Credentials Framework is based on the New Zealand Qualifications and Credentials Framework. It's not run by Waka Kotahi, and we don't set the standards. Those standards are going to be set by the national training bodies alongside industry. So the current trainer and assessor warrants that we at Waka Kotahi issue are only valid for Waka Kotahi workshops and assessments. So that means that the new training, the new framework won't automatically be available to Waka Kotahi trainers and assessors to deliver. But we do have some advice for the current trainers and assessors if they want to be able to deliver on the new framework to get themselves aligned with that. So one option is for you to work for a registered training provider who's accredited to deliver the credentials and is looking for experts in the field. So that might be your like the PTEs that are either currently PTEs or that are looking to become PTEs in the near future. You could become a registered NZQA provider yourself, and there's more information available on that on the NZQA website. Or you could be employed as a trainer by a employer. So that's like a vocational employer, rather than maybe as if you're currently a trainer delivering TTM training solely, you might want to be employed by a big company who needs to train their own people regularly, because each of the credentials will have their own delivery methods and will be delivered in-house by trainers employed by those companies. So you can align yourself with them if you're an individual looking for how you can deliver that training in the future. And over to Melissa now.
Oh, so I'll just pick up on some of these questions that are there. So what is a provider? So a provider is an NZQA registered training provider. So providers do have to apply for accreditation to deliver the credentials. Only those that are NZQA accreditation approved are able to deliver and award those certificates. And how is the new framework different from how the training assessors works? So each registered provider who has their own accreditation to deliver, they'll determine their own delivery for each of those credentials. Each provider will have their own process for registration. For example, for Connexus, for the risk and design credentials, which have been listed on NZQA already, Connexus have used an expression of interest processes. So asking those who are interested in having those added to their scope to express that interest to us so that we can work through the process with those people. The current scopes under the current system do remain the same for now, but these are against individual unit standards. And the new framework that we're talking about here is based on credentials. So the expression of interest process will be used for each of those credentials as they are created for us to work through so we can get registered for those. And around subcontractors, Connexus doesn't have a lot of subcontract arrangements, but in some instances we would work with other NZQA registered training providers who have the necessary expertise, capability, and capacity to partner with Connexus for the delivery of the credentials. We would also potentially talking about assessors. So if we are looking at getting external assessors to help where companies don't have the capacity or capability for having a workplace assessor, we would also contract assessors to help in that capacity as well.
Thanks, Melissa. And you actually get the next question too, but I'm going to dive in with a live one straight away because it's quite topical. How does this training and assessment model work for smaller businesses who don't have the capacity to internally train their staff and currently use external providers? I just wonder whether you might want to talk to the wider civil industry and how the civil industry works like that now, because Connexus has obviously historically been the industry training organization for construction and infrastructure. And maybe that might give people an insight into how Connexus actually does its work and how it engages with smaller companies currently, because really we're coming into line with how the wider civil industry actually works.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. Currently, in other industries such as civil infrastructure, a lot of our qualifications or programs are delivered through on-job training. So that's where the employer is supporting the learner to learn on the job. We then have either workplace assessors who work with those learners and work for the company to assess them on the job. But a lot of the smaller businesses might not have that role employed in their workforce. And that's where we have the expertise of external assessors that we contract as Connexus to be able to support the learner, support the employer, and complete that assessment. Still on the job, but they're not necessarily working for that place of employment.
Cool. So I suppose it's important for people to recognize the relationship between the learner and the provider is really important. The provider manages the relationship with the learner, and then the provider manages the relationship with the assessors and trainers who will support that learner through the journey. That's their method of managing quality and all of that stuff. So there is a distinction there between how the model currently operates, that the providers take a lot stronger role in making sure that the learners get what they need in the method, in the model that they need it. So we move on to the next question, and Melissa, you get to keep talking, sorry. And this one's around recognition of current competency. So that's an important topic for people, that they have existing competency potentially in the system, and they're keen to hear, what happens now? How does that get recognized, or how might it be transferred or migrated?
So each provider will have their own process for RCC, or recognition of current competency. At Connexus, this process is called Advanced Portfolio Assessment, or APA, and that's where we'd be looking at each credential as it comes through and looking at the existing skills and knowledge that learners might have, the existing evidence that they would already have from their workplace, and then we would look at if there were any gaps from the credential to that evidence that they've got, fulfilling that through a professional discussion with an assessor. If you flip through to the next slide, we've got a little bit of an example there, looking at the TTM design one as an example. And you can see there that it shows, we'd be looking at the existing evidence that someone would have and how that maps through to the credential, and then identifying any gaps that were there, and then making sure that there's a way that we can fill in those gaps. So that's sort of a rough idea of how you could see how that mapping process would work for Connexus. But as I mentioned, each provider would have their own process for this.
And I might call on Paul Tyson again on this one, because Paul actually worked with Connexus a little bit on developing some of the mapping for the TTM design one. So that process is still in the works, and it's still being developed. But maybe, Paul, you could talk to it from a contractor lens and say, look, this is sort of what I saw, and maybe give people some information about how it works.
Yep, cool. Yeah, having been involved in the process, we do know there are some gaps. The obvious ones is the current training doesn't do a lot around more risk-based approach, doing risk assessments and those sorts of things. Ultimately, there'll be other credentials. The proposal is to have other credentials that support risk assessment. But how does risk assessment then translate and relate to doing a temperature management design? What are the elements within a design that pull from the risk assessment, work through the selection of controls and all those sorts of things? So we know there's some gaps around that. The work we did do at the time, we had a measure of confidence that there's naturally occurring evidence that will already be out there that will actually help fill some of those gaps. to achieve this, and Melissa can beat me up if I'm overstepping my bounds. This is more of a contractor lens, not a Connexus or another provider's lens. But we don't necessarily need to perform an assessment on an example. We can actually use various examples and pieces of evidence and demonstrate how somebody's evolving knowledge and competencies and capabilities in the planning space would stack up to provide the evidence to be able to go in and complete the RCC process and achieve the qualification. So the great thing about even this at the proposed level for this skill standard was that it should be naturally occurring. It can be vocational. There may be specific training elements and things that be in the background, either within your employer's organisation, your home organisation, or through your provider, or a combination of both. But that it should be on job. You need to be doing things your employer's way, whilst following good practice set by industry's sort of good practices and examples, and produce naturally occurring evidence. I think this is the key one here, and that the holes, where we identify the holes, and there is an RCC process in place with a provider, that it can be filled simply with, like I say, natural evidence, professional conversation, those sorts of things. It's so I don't want to make it sound more simple than it is, but it actually isn't really that hard either. It definitely isn't. Sorry, hopefully that was on the mark.
Perfect. Appreciate it. We'll move on to the next one, which actually I'm going to call on Betty to jump into. So this one's more talking about what the framework covers and what would still be left to employers. And I know, Betty, you've got another slide there that you want to talk to as well. So over to you.
Cool. So obviously under the Health and Safety at Work Act, in reference to duty of care, a business or undertaking, so the PCBU must look after the health and safety of its workers and any other workers it influences or directs. So this includes anybody in that contracting chain. PCBUs have always had the responsibility to meet their duty of care, and the proposed framework represents a solid foundation to develop good skills for people in TTM. The framework we've developed covers common TTM tasks and skills. However, it does not cover all of your PCBU responsibilities. This is something that's also articulated in the New Zealand Guide, which highlights that a PCBU can't completely lean on the framework. So, with that being said, PCBUs need to ensure that all staff have the required competencies beyond those covered in the framework to safely carry out their tasks and to ensure that there is a mechanism in place to support current and ongoing competence during the employee's life cycle. Next slide, please. So the dots here represent skills, knowledge, and competency for a person. All the dots are different elements of the skills someone may need. Cool, thank you. A bunch of the needs for the person will be covered by the credential framework, as we've shown in the representation here. Things like how risk assessment works and how to give a good toolbox talk, or what the role of the shadow vehicle is. But a bunch of the dots won't be able to be covered by the credential framework because they are specific to the company or the person's role or the individual's learning needs. That's where the PCBUs or organisation needs to still do their part. Think about how you currently work. When you get an STMS warrant, does that include all the things you need to know and be good at to be an effective STMS? No, it does not. It is the same here. There is and always will be a need for employers to fill the gap between the common framework and what their people actually need. And this should be happening now and will continue to happen in the future. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much. That's good. And so the next one is still with you, and it's more about how does this play out there?
Yeah, so in terms of how this might play out in a contractual environment, a few questions have come up around the framework being voluntary rather than compulsory. And as Dave said earlier on, the same could have also been said about the warrant system. So the warrant system is linked to COPTM, and by referencing COPTM as a requirement for TTM in the contract, essentially has forced the deployment of the warrant system and its turn, its universal adoption. Regarding the credentials framework, it may play out in a similar way. Where we may see it pop up in a contractual environment is through a client requirement around specifications or qualifications. For examples, all TTM workers must hold XYZ qualifications. We anticipate that over time, large contracting PCBUs may require it, and such as in a way that all construction sites require site-safe passports as an example, and so on.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And we've got three sort of pre-prepared questions still to go. Next one comes through around evidence and evidence of competency. So Tom Kittle's going to dive in with assistance from Melanie Millison to have a go at this one. Tom and Mel.
Dave. So this question actually has a few possible answers. So, because the question's kind of a little bit ambiguous in terms of who we're actually providing the evidence to. But if you think around HASWA is the act that actually requires PCBUs to ensure their staff are suitably competent. And so that has not changed. That act exists now. It will exist hopefully in the distant future as well, and certainly whether it's under the COPTM training and competency or under the proposed framework, the responsibility for the PCBU still sits with providing evidence or having evidence and ensuring their staff are actually competent. Now, and the Health and Safety Act, Work Act, is actually enforced by WorkSafe. So it's not an RCA responsibility. It's not another party's responsibility. Now, the other part of this question is ultimately around who you're providing the evidence to, because there's obviously a supposition that you're providing evidence to WorkSafe, but potentially staff might need to provide evidence to prospective employers, and that's going to be up to the employer as to what they need from an employee to prove that they are competent. There's going to be a variety of methodologies that different PCBUs might use, and one of them might be, as a requirement for example, their clients, is to actually have a qualification. That's entirely up to the PCBU. In the other space, in the assurance and monitoring space, there is a probable outcome where the assurance space will not necessarily ask for proof of competence, depending on who they're doing the assurance and monitoring for. If they're doing it for the PCBU, obviously they're going to be asking different questions to, for example, an RCA, who might simply be wanting to know whether there is actually an STMS on site. Whether they're competent or not is not something that will be able to be tested purely on site. Melanie, is there anything more you want to add?
Yep. I think we have covered that, but I suppose just to add that all organisations as PCBUs are required to maintain up-to-date records of all their staff training and competencies, and we expect that that's going to continue going forward, and there should be a lot more emphasis on that. So we can provide that information to whoever is asking for evidence of the competencies.
Awesome. Thanks, team. We've got two more questions to go, pre-prepared ones, and then we're going to go to some of the ones that are in the Q&A. The next one, we come loop all the way back to Melissa. And this is talking about funding. So keen to hear from Connexus's point of view as a provider. How does funding actually work? Because I'll obviously highlight to everyone that our current model is an entirely user-pay system. So everything all the training that we undertake within the system is paid for by the users, and we don't have access to or utilization of any tertiary education commission funding currently, which is available to a number of different industries through the TEC. So Melissa, keen to hear from you how this plays out, and maybe give people an indication of what funding actually looks like in a vocational system and what we might be able to do.
Sure. So training providers can apply to TEC for funding that supports the development and delivery of training against credentials. And it is a set rate. So we don't get to ask for a specific amount or anything like that. It is set by TEC, or the Tertiary Education Commission. That funding subsidises the enrolment fee. So there are still fees at the time of signing up, and it will be different for each credential because it does depend upon the delivery modes. So with TEC as well, there is different funding rates that are set based on the mode of delivery. So typically speaking for Connexus, our main mode of delivery is through work-based training. And so that's what we would receive funding for our programs and credentials.
Awesome, thank you. And we go to our final pre-prepared question, and we go to Bruce and Wayne. Not Bruce Wayne, but Bruce and Wayne. These two are going to help us out with this question just around cost, because it's an important component for people. There's anxiety around cost, and obviously that has an implication for people's commercial performance for their organization. So what are your comments on this one, team?
Yeah, it's obviously a real burning question and a popular one. To sort of answer it, I'd like to use Coastline as an example, and it's good news, really. Like currently, the current training and competency process is very prescriptive, and for businesses like ours, we actually have to go and set up fake closures basically to meet the needs of them. Whereas this in the future will be able to having on-site training. What was that anyway?
Yeah, you can do your assessments on your own work sites. So essentially, your costs where beforehand you might have gone to that sort of pretend closure that Bruce was talking about to get your assessment or a verification done. Now you can use your work sites, your everyday on-job work sites, as your evidence check or your training classroom, I guess, as the big difference. Mm-hmm. So will there be a reduction of cost? Absolutely, depending on how each PCBU chooses to deploy that and have your at-work training delivered. I think one other massive benefit is there's a wider array of delivery methods. So how you choose to train or support all your learners at each organization, you've got a lot more flexibility, whereas before it was definitely in the classroom and then definitely on the assessment. You can now help your learners. There might be some more online training available to simulate those sort of classroom learning sessions. With the providers that will be able to service the industry, there's a lot more flexibility and opportunity. And like Melissa mentioned, a lot more funding that potentially will then get passed down to help benefit each learner and each PCBU. So while we can't give you an exact number of how much it's going to reduce by, we know there's a reduction and some relief coming.
Awesome. Thanks, team. So that's the end of our pre-prepared questions, and I'll just highlight to you the panelists we've got in the background. So there's quite a few people in the background. Some of these are here, some of them weren't able to join us just yet, but a good 3/4 of the people on that page are available in the background to answer questions. The majority of those people have been part of the Credentials Framework Working Group from different backgrounds, so the likes of Wayne and Joe as TTM providers, Kim from NZTA, Melanie representing ACNZ, so that's the Association of Consulting Engineers. So you can see there's quite a lot of diverse backgrounds from across the industry that have contributed to the development of this framework. So appreciate your efforts, team. Thank you very much. And also appreciate your contribution to the questions that are coming through. I just want to, before we go to live questions, I want to just bring up a quote that came back from an RCA survey that was done by Rachel Taylor, who is a member of the ISG. Rachel did some work with RCAs, and this was one of the responses. And I thought it was important to share this with everyone to say, look, there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, and it can feel pretty overwhelming. This is a relatively significant change, even just outside of credentials. This is a significant change for the New Zealand TTM industry to go through. Everyone is feeling that. And it's important to recognize that it's okay. It's okay that this is that you're feeling anxious, you're uncertain, you're afraid, you're worried, you're not sure what to do. This is going to take time to evolve towards some more certainty. So I encourage you to ask questions, learn, lean in, look for as many answers as you can, ask others, work with others, and consider whether your questions are the same as theirs. Reach out, engage, collaborate. That's what will help everyone get through this. So That's why this Q&A webinar is valuable, and hopefully we can answer some of the questions that as best we know at this particular stage in the process. So on that, we're going to move on to some questions that have come through the chat, and we've got probably 10 to 15 minutes that we can do those for. So the first one I want to go to is around timeframes. So I'm going to call on Betty for this one, and just to talk through possibly what timeframes are you expecting, or are we expecting here to see these credentials come through and become available? And then how long will it take for all of them to come through, for the whole framework to be delivered? And then transitionally, what that might look like. How will we see those things turn on and then turn off the old model?
Yeah, sure, Dave. So at current, there is no definitive time frame nor an end date to the current warrant system. What there will be, though, is a modular transition from the warrant system to the credential framework. And for an endpoint perspective, that might take somewhere between 2 to 3 years. As a guide, we are currently tracking for the end of May for the availability of the risk assessment and TTM micro-credential, and the end of July for the TTM design micro-credential. These timeframes are heavily dependent on the training and the assessment design process that Connexus is currently working through. But once this is complete, the next step will be the turning off of the associated warrant. And in this particular case, considering that the the risk assessment and TTM micro-credential is new, the TTM design will be the TTM planner warrant. So as we progress through the rest of the credential framework, the same process will play out again in a modular fashion. Once all the parts of the qualification are developed, training and assessment materials included, no doubt the associated warrant will be switched off. And maybe Kim could add to this if you're around, Kim.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We won't be turning off the NZTA training system until there's replacements available in this framework. So it will be done iteratively. And like Betty said, the first will be the planner. We are looking at the moment to turn the planner qualification off around at the end of April or May, depending on how many people want to still do that training, and we'll keep the assessment option open until the design credential is available for people to be trained and assessed in. But if you've got feedback on that, also love to hear it.
Awesome, thanks. And speaking to that, I suppose that's the first live example of transition, is we're going to see, first of all, the new risk assessment and TTM credential come online somewhere in the realm of maybe May, depending, or certainly from Connexus. That's the timeline possibly, and then the TTM design one after that. So those are the two that are already on the NZQA framework, and they'll be coming live later this year. So we're already seeing some of the credentials developing and being landing hopefully soon. There's another question here I want to come to next, and maybe Tom might be able to help us out with this. And this is in relation to whether RCAs adopt or seek to continue with COPTM. So I'll read the question out. Where are we? Let me just find it. Or if I can find it. I can't, but I'll paraphrase what I read, and that is, if RCAs choose to continue with using COPTM, how does that work under, with training and competency and so forth? Tom, if you're around, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this as an RCA representative, but remembering that the training and competency model currently, as published by NZTA, is part of COPTM. So if as COPTM becomes retired, that training model ceases to exist. So it's not really possible to retain it unless someone else was to adopt and offer that. But there wouldn't be any necessary obligation to adhere to it, because there's no central entity in that system demanding its utilization. So again, it comes back to the PCBUs being ultimately responsible for the training and instruction they give their people. Tom, do you want to add anything from an RCA perspective?
Ditto. Look, I would say it would be problematic for an RCA to try and retain COPTM, which, as you say, obviously contains the training. If the training, no, let me rephrase that, as the training will be turned off, so NZTA won't be providing that framework. So if an RCA chose to try and retain COPTM, they'd have to actually effectively stand up their own training, which would well, that might be one option, and which would then put them responsible for the training of people working on their network, which is obviously exposing more risk to that RCA. I would say it would be unwise.
Thanks. And as an RCA representative yourself, that's a credible answer.
Yeah, AT has made a decision, I'm going to say a year ago, that in fact, actually it's probably a year and a half ago, that we were going to move to New Zealand Guide, and that incorporates everything associated with that, including the turning off of the Copton training and supporting the qualifications framework.
Thanks. And so I found the question to make sure we've answered it. If an RCA chooses to stick with Coptum and these, is this realistically an option? How will contractors do this as there is no STMS warrant system? So importantly, is it realistically an option? I would suggest that Tom's indicating that it's not realistically an option. So, you know, RCAs, I encourage you, if you're an RCA representative, reach out to Tom. As a member of the Credentials Group, of course, you've got Rachel Taylor and also Simon Hodges from Christchurch City Council on the ISG who are across this and can certainly help you with how, as an RCA, you might be understanding this.
And Sean Maxwell.
Sorry, and Sean Maxwell from Waimakariri District Council, who's also part of the Credentials Framework. Okay, continuing on with some more live questions. I am just scrolling through. We've answered a couple of these. There's one here around, under the former models, there was an intent to have a standardized approach across New Zealand for TTM. Moving forward, we'll no longer have any standardized approach. Is there no concerns around the level of delivery we're going to have under the new model? Looks like we're going backwards, not forwards. So it's a pretty confrontational question potentially, and I'm keen to hear possibly either Bruce and Wayne, or maybe Paul might have a view on this, and just how maybe this relates to a training perspective. What's your take?
Who are you asking, Dave, Paul, Bruce, or myself?
Well, yeah, if you're talking now, so maybe it's you.
I was typing away. Just refresh me on the question again.
Okay, so under the former models, there's an intent to have a standardized approach across New Zealand for TTM. Moving forward, they'll no longer have a standardized approach. Is there no concerns around the level of delivery we're going to have under the new model? So if you can relate that specifically to training, if we're talking about training, the potential for differences in training and difference in standardization around how people are trained or what kind of skills and competencies they have, as a specific lens on that question, being that the topic we're talking about today.
Yeah, I think from a training perspective, the framework itself is trying to standardize that and create recognizable, probably smaller building blocks of skill standards, which group to micro-credentials. So I think there is some continuity if you subscribe to this framework about how that can be delivered up and down the country to keep it consistent, because that's a very key, it's an important question. And we think this framework helps us going a long way towards beginning to deliver that properly. These standards are being developed by the tag groups. So they are technical advisors who are looking at what compiles a skills standard or what goes into the competencies for that supervision block. So I think we're trying to learn from our previous gaps in old frameworks and trying to reassemble it in a really good one this time around. And one of the things I love from a training perspective in this is those unit standards or skill standards get reviewed, I think, every 3 years. And so there's really good continuous ability for us to improve the framework ourselves as industry. Given we've been practicing it and we notice a new gap, we can update it again and go again.
Yeah, awesome, thanks. And I know, Paul, you've just let me know that you want to add to that. So keen to hear what contribution, even from a wider perspective, you can talk to.
Yep, thanks. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to jump on that one and sort of maybe just expand on what we understand standards actually means. Lots of chatter lately, sort of through a lot of the social media and things like that talks about compliance. Some of the work that's sort of happening in the background is actually just understanding what are the actual standards and what are the musts. So there's a bunch of legal musts we have to do. It's all based in legislation. There's good practice shoulds. There's stuff we should just be doing. It's established through good practice. I don't want to use the dirty word because I don't have enough money in my pocket to put a coin in the swear jar, but Comptum actually does establish some good practices, and that's not to say we're going to deviate from those massively. So there's some standards by which we'll continue to operate. the way TTM appears on the road isn't going to change drastically in the very near future. So there's still a measure of standard. And then there's a bunch of coulds, all the additional stuff we could do. We could apply some new innovation. We could engage with our clients and our RCAs about how we might test something. So what I wanted to just plant the idea with the industry is that compliance can actually be broken down into legal musts, good practice shoulds, and everything else we could do to make the environment safe for our people and for road users. And that's the way I tend to look at standards.
Yeah, awesome. Appreciate it. Okay, we've probably got time for one or two more questions. There is a bunch in the Q&A, and I appreciate people submitting those. If we can't get through them all, we will come back to them in written form to everyone. I'm going to jump back to Tom again for this one, and this is talking about with this framework, how does an RCA ensure contractors, staff working on the road are appropriately trained when you're accepting a TMP or approving a works access permit? Currently, a non-conformance can threaten their warrant and send them back for retraining. What's the consequences under the system, and can contractors with substandard skills continue to work on the road reserve? So, Tom, you might have already thought about this from an RCA perspective. Keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So this one's an interesting one. The current COPTM pool of effectively non-conformancing an STMS off the network due to poor performance, we've found is quite a ineffective and unfair tool, is probably the best way of putting it. The methodology we've used for a number of years now is somewhat to ignore the STMS. That's not entirely true, but for the purposes of notices, it is, and to focus on the organisations, or in Haswa speak, the PCBU. You've heard us talk about the PCBU a lot recently. So when we issue notices for a site which is poorly performing, it is focused on the PCBU and all PCBUs involved in that result, because the reality is that it's typically not one person who's created a failure. It's been multiple failures, and usually, or in many cases, the failures that the STMS has been left holding ultimately are caused by defects in the system further up the chain. Could be with the client, could be with the contractor, could be with the work crew, could be whatever. And so it's the responsibility of the PCBU to deal with those defects, if you will. And so a potential cause of that is a lack of training or a lack of competence in the STMS. And again, that is the PCBU responsibility. If they've engaged an STMS who is not adequately trained, instructed, or managed to do a safe site, well, the fact that the site is not safe is the responsibility of the PCBUs involved. And so the notices should be dealing with that. Now, potentially that opens up a conversation around, well, if we have some poor contractors or PCBUs working on the network, how do we deal with that? And that's a topic for another day.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. We've got time for probably one more live question very quickly, and I'm going to pick this one and have a go at it myself. The question is, what other options are there if an RCA does not wish to adopt the NZG TTM? So I want to reframe this for whoever asked it. The NZG TTM is a voluntary document that is not set in legislation. It's not for adoption or not for adoption. What you must do is adhere to the Health and Safety at Work Act. All organisations must, including the RCA. The NZG TTM is a mechanism that describes how you could give effect to your obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So it is not really for an RCA to adopt the NZG TTM as a foundational document. It's simply guidance. You can't necessarily hold on to COPTM and make that the basis of how you're giving effect to the Health and Safety at Work Act, given that in places it's incompatible. It doesn't allow for correct adherence to the Health and Safety at Work Act. So I'd suggest whoever asked that question, go back a step go back to the legislative requirements that you have, and you might realize that actually no single guidance document or framework is actually going to give 100% adherence. And you need to look at the system as to how you give systemic effect to the Health and Safety at Work Act. So there's a couple of other questions in there that we won't get time to answer. We are at time. I want to close out with one final point, which is just around what do we do now, and giving people a little bit of advice about that. First of all, the feedback on the credentials framework concludes next Friday, the 5th of April, and we encourage you to go and visit the ISG website, grab the feedback form, and then fill out your thoughts and share your feedback. But also, now you've got a bit more of a depth of understanding of the credentials framework. Have a think about how you might deploy this framework in your organization. If you haven't already got a clear picture of the competencies you need across the different roles, start there. So compile a matrix of the roles that you've got and the skills they might need. And then you could see which of those skills might be provided by the framework and which you might need to get from elsewhere. And also, this isn't happening overnight. So the consultation of this framework closes next Friday, but after that, the working group will comb through all of the feedback and make adjustments as required, and a final published version of the framework will be available later this year. So this isn't happening immediately. This is a process of consultation that will lead to a more solid, crystallized framework later this year, which then can be implemented over the subsequent next couple of years. And I know, Paul, you wanted to add some comments on that. So keen for you to close out maybe and give us your final thoughts, the last word. If you're there still, I hope.
Sorry, mate. I was just having a technical difficulty there. Sorry, what was that?
I just recall you wanted to have the last word almost on what people can do from here. So what do I do now? And maybe you can give your closing advice to everyone before we finish up.
Oh, okay. Put me on the spot with that one, actually, but that's fine. I'll grab the last word. My advice is obviously get involved in the framework. Seek to understand it. Seek to give your feedback. We are very interested in your thoughts and opinions. It is for industry, by industry. Can't repeat that enough. Understand it. Definitely go seek some additional advice and understand roles and responsibilities, accountabilities as PCBUs, where you and your organisation may fit within a contracting chain, and how your functions and roles, responsibilities, and potentially your liabilities may stack up within that contracting chain. So I myself tend to look through a lens of lead contractor. Working for Fulton Hogan, we engage a lot of subcontractors to undertake work for us. And how do we actually engage with those subcontractors and those sorts of things? There's a couple of questions there I was actually furiously trying to answer while I wasn't paying any attention to Dave. One of them was around will the lead contractors adopt this? To be fair, we don't know yet. We don't know if we'll prescribe this through our subcontract engagement. We are still yet to make those decisions. What I can say, though, is we definitely highly endorse the use of a framework and measures of qualification, and we'll have potentially additional requirements around the competency developments and competency management, ongoing verification of competencies, refresher information, refresher workshops. You know, that stuff's all still there, still looking to be developed and supported. Hopefully that's enough, gives people to dwell on and maybe go and do some homework.
Yep, awesome. Appreciate it, Paul. Thanks, team. We're slightly over time. Those that have submitted questions that haven't yet been answered, we will answer those in writing and be able to produce some more content back to you in good time. And so do go and sign up to the TTM ISG newsletter, and that's where the primary method of communication will come from. Thanks, team. Thanks to all those that have answered and contributed to questions. Well done. Appreciate your work. Ka kite.